Is it possible to create an Iron Man suit in real life? Could a person safely fly in such a suit? What new technologies would be required to make it possible? In this episode, we will analyze Tony Stark's Mark III suit from the 2008 film Iron Man through the lens of physics and modern technology. This is MiliTime Fiction. Let's begin. In reality, Iron Man's armor could be described as an airtight powered flying exoskeleton equipped with a life support system. The suit would absolutely have to be sealed. Without airtight protection, it would be impossible to safely fly at high altitudes or move underwater, as later shown in the Avengers films. The suit assembly process in the movie looks spectacular, but from an engineering perspective, it raises serious questions. We never see any visible sealing mechanisms. The armor is assembled from many separate pieces, yet there would have to be seals between them. Otherwise, the structure would not be able to maintain pressure or protect the pilot. A more realistic solution would be to build the suit from several large modules. For example, an upper and lower body section connected at a single locking point. This would make airtight sealing much more practical and improve the suit's reliability. However, the assembly sequence would no longer look nearly as cinematic as it does in the film. The armor may look convincing visually, but only if we imagine it being used for walking rather than high-speed flight. Its shape is poorly suited for flying at high velocity. The human body naturally has terrible aerodynamics because humans were never designed to fly. To reduce air resistance and lower energy consumption, the armor's surface would need to be much smoother. It would also require a large aerodynamic fairing around the head and shoulders. During flight, the pilot's arms would likely need to remain fixed in a specific position. At speeds above 200 kilometers per hour or 124 miles per hour, airflow naturally pushes the body toward a more streamlined shape, while protruding elements, hands, fingers, and armor components generate turbulence. There is another major issue as well. At supersonic speeds, the surface of the suit would heat up dramatically. This creates the risk of seals melting and jamming the opening mechanism, similar to what happened in some high-speed aircraft such as the MiG-31 and MiG-25, where cockpit canopies occasionally fuse to the aircraft frame due to extreme heat. In aviation, the canopy is the transparent enclosure that protects the pilot from incoming airflow. Because of this, Tony Stark would realistically have only two options: either use materials with extremely high heat resistance or avoid flying at excessively high speeds. In the movies, the Mark III suit is made from a titanium gold alloy, but how good of a material choice is that? In reality, similar alloys do exist. First, such materials may be resistant to icing in the upper atmosphere. Second, titanium has excellent tensile strength while remaining relatively lightweight, although it is not always stronger than steel on its own. However, certain titanium-based alloys can significantly improve structural durability. At the same volume, titanium is roughly 30% lighter than steel, which is extremely important for a flying suit. From a weight to strength perspective, the material choice makes sense. However, there is a scene in the movie where Iron Man is hit by a tank shell. Could the suit realistically survive something like that? Judging by the visible damage, the tank appears to have fired a high explosive fragmentation shell rather than an armor-piercing round. Such ammunition damages targets not only through impact, but also through blast waves and shrapnel. If you look closely at the marks left on the armor, they do resemble the aftermath of a fragmentation explosion. Such shells are typically used against fortifications, infantry, or lightly armored vehicles. Since Tony Stark's enemies were seeing the suit for the first time, it is reasonable to assume they would classify it as a lightly armored target. Yet Tony survives, and the suit suffers no critical damage. The very idea of hitting such a small and fast-moving target with a tank shell is already highly improbable. But even if we assume the hit actually happened, armor strength alone would not be enough to protect the pilot. The greatest danger would come from what is known as behind-armor blunt trauma, the shockwave generated by the explosion. Even if the armor plates remained intact, the pilot's internal organs could still suffer catastrophic injuries. The exoskeleton's actuators would not be capable of fully compensating for an impact of that magnitude. Most likely, the pilot would suffer severe internal trauma. A much heavier suit like the Hulkbuster might have a chance of surviving such a hit, but the classic Mark III almost certainly would not. One could argue that the shell struck at the edge of its effective range and had already lost much of its energy. In the film, Tony appears to be flying at an altitude of only around 150 to 200 meters, or 500 to 650 feet. At that range, survival would be extremely unlikely. There is also another serious design weakness worth mentioning: the relatively exposed power source. In essence, this component is the heart of the entire system, yet in the movie, it is protected only by a transparent material. Even if we assume it is bulletproof bulletproof glass, that level of protection would still be far from sufficient. In a real combat suit, this area would likely receive the heaviest armor protection of all. In fact, placing the power source on the back would probably make more sense, since it would reduce the chances of a direct frontal hit. However, Tony Stark has a unique problem. The reactor is embedded inside his chest and also keeps him alive. Even so, covering it with additional armor would be much more practical than turning it into a bright glowing target. The same logic applies to the glowing lights on the helmet. They only make the pilot easier to spot, especially in darkness. Now let's examine how Tony Stark actually flies. From the film, one can conclude that two fundamentally new technologies were created for the suit: the repulsor, an engine that does not require conventional fuel, and the arc reactor for powering the system. ARC stands for Affordable Robust Compact. These technologies are interconnected, but let us first consider the engines. The Iron Man suit is equipped with a repulsor propulsion system. These are energy devices capable of emitting a stream of energy for attack or movement. The main engines are installed in the boots. They create the primary thrust vector for takeoff, hovering, and flight. Powerful streams of energy are emitted from the soles of the feet. The repulsors in the palms function as auxiliary engines for maneuvering, stabilization, and braking. Tony literally controls his trajectory by changing the position of his hands. It is assumed that repulsors operate on the principle of an electromagnetic field or the control of high-energy particle flows. This generates forces that allow Iron Man to hover in the air or fire energy blasts. Naturally, these engines are entirely fictional and belong to the realm of science fiction. In reality, repulsor technology does not exist. However, there is ongoing research into the development of plasma engines that can operate without liquid fuel. Chinese researchers have introduced an experimental concept for an atmospheric plasma engine. The idea is that air is compressed by a compressor, then converted into a plasma state using microwaves, after which a reactive jet is expelled. The higher the supplied electrical power, the higher the plasma temperature and the potential thrust. But the technology has received serious criticism. Other researchers have pointed out that the initial calculations may have been overly optimistic, and some efficiency estimates appeared physically questionable. In addition, transitioning from a laboratory prototype to a fully functional aviation engine could prove extremely difficult due to plasma instability and enormous energy consumption. Nevertheless, it cannot be ruled out that some of these technical problems may eventually be solved in the future. But how energy intensive would such a system be? Extremely energy intensive. To fly the way Tony Stark does with small nozzles and high maneuverability, an enormous amount of energy would be required, hundreds or even thousands of kilowatts of power. In the world of Iron Man, this problem is solved by the arc reactor, but no one has built one in reality so far. There is another obvious limitation. Space travel or underwater movement using such an atmospheric plasma engine would be impossible, because there is no oxygen in the surrounding environment, which the system requires to operate. Consequently, the pilot would be unable to move or breathe in a vacuum. Separate supplies of fuel and oxygen would still be necessary for space travel. Now let us discuss what the arc reactor is. It does not exist in reality, but there are several scientific fields that could be considered its distant relatives. The closest analogy is a compact fusion reactor. The idea is to confine ultra-hot plasma using magnets in a tokamak-type installation. The biggest problem is that the plasma must be hotter than the center of the sun, and it cannot come into contact with the reactor walls. It has to float within a magnetic field. Apart from the fact that even in an industrial setting, this is currently impossible to achieve, Tony Stark certainly would not be able to install such a hot reactor in his chest. In fact, he could not realistically install any reactor in his chest, but a tokamak definitely would not be an option. There is also the concept of a cold fusion reactor. The idea is to achieve the same type of fusion at room temperature or close to it without requiring millions of degrees. The most famous case was the experiment conducted by Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons in 1989. They claimed that using palladium and heavy water in an experimental setup, they had generated excess heat, supposedly from a nuclear reaction. This sounds much closer to what is shown in the film, doesn't it? Unfortunately, it soon became clear that this was not a viable method. As a result, modern science still lacks even a widely accepted theoretical model for a compact cold fusion reactor. Therefore, today this remains the most fantastical element of Iron Man's armor. It cannot be properly evaluated even at the theoretical level, but let us imagine that humanity eventually succeeds in creating both a compact cold fusion reactor and an efficient non-chemical plasma engine. Would that mean the Iron Man suit could become reality? Not quite. Even then, several serious engineering challenges would still remain. The first problem is body stabilization during horizontal flight. Vertical takeoff is is easier to justify. Thrust is directed downward and directly counteracts gravity, but horizontal flight is much more complicated. In the films, Tony Stark often flies parallel to the ground without directing the hand-mounted thrusters downward. This seems strange, especially considering that after his first failed test flight, he specifically added arm thrusters to improve stability. If no upward force is generated during horizontal movement, the pilot would gradually lose altitude due to gravity. Airplanes solve this problem with wings and aerodynamic surfaces, which generate lift even at relatively low speeds. The Iron Man suit has no wings. A more practical design would likely place the thrusters on the calves, instead of directly under the feet, similar to the Javelin suit in the video game Anthem. This placement would improve both stability and usability. It would also prevent another obvious issue. Thrusters located in the soles of the feet could easily become clogged with mud or debris. The second problem is cooling. Any system capable of sustained flight would generate a tremendous amount of heat. If the suit overheated, its electronics could fail, and the pilot would quickly find themselves in a life-threatening situation. The films never clearly explain how Tony Stark solves this issue. Perhaps the system relies partly on airflow cooling during descent. One could also imagine rapid cooling through water immersion, but that introduces another problem. First, the engines would need to remain functional underwater. Second, rapidly cooling extremely hot materials would create severe thermal stress. In real-world conditions, this could lead to microfractures and structural failure. Because of that, water cooling does not appear to be a realistic solution. The third problem involves breathing. At altitudes above roughly 3,000 meters, or 10,000 feet, air becomes significantly less suitable for human respiration. Oxygen levels decrease and atmospheric pressure drops. Without support systems, a person would quickly experience oxygen deprivation and potentially lose consciousness. Yet people regularly fly in passenger aircraft at altitudes of around 10 to 12 kilometers, or 33,000 to 39,000 feet. The reason is simple. Modern aircraft use cabin pressurization and air conditioning systems. Air is drawn from outside, is compressed, and adjusted to make breathing safe inside the cabin. A similar but much more compact system would almost certainly be necessary inside an Iron Man suit. Otherwise, Tony Stark would simply suffocate at high altitude. The fourth problem is G-forces. G-force describes how much a person's effective weight changes during acceleration or deceleration. Even an ordinary elevator creates a brief sensation of increased weight during sudden movement. Now imagine accelerating from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour, or 155 miles per hour, in just a few seconds. Under those conditions, the human body would experience forces comparable to what fighter pilots endure. And fighter pilots are highly trained professionals who spend years preparing for these physical stresses. The movies never suggest that Tony Stark underwent astronaut level or military pilot training. Because of this, during sudden accelerations, especially near instant transitions to supersonic speed, he would most likely lose consciousness very quickly. Blood would drain away from the brain toward the lower body, and without a highly advanced autopilot system, the result would almost certainly be fatal. It is important to understand that pilots survive high G forces not only because of training, but also because of specialized anti-G suits. These suits work by detecting acceleration and applying pressure to specific areas of the body, especially around the legs and abdomen. This helps prevent blood from pooling in the lower body and reduces the risk of blacking out. Judging by the films, Tony Stark may have something similar. Perhaps that is the purpose of the black undersuit with visible tubing beneath the armor. Even technology like this would not solve the core problem. An untrained person simply cannot endure extreme acceleration on a constant basis. On top of that, the human body has physical limits. At sufficiently high G-forces, severe injuries become increasingly likely, including spinal damage, and no exoskeleton could completely eliminate that risk. Beyond G-forces, there is another fundamental issue, the law of conservation of momentum. When the suit's engines suddenly accelerate, the momentum of the entire system changes, both the armor and the person inside it. The pilot's body naturally tries to remain in its previous state of rest. That is why rapid acceleration pushes people back into their seats, or in Iron Man's case, violently into the inside of the suit. Modern fighter pilots accelerate gradually rather than instantly, unlike the way Tony Stark flies in the movies. Sustained acceleration with near-instant transitions to extremely high speeds is dangerous even for trained professionals. Theoretically, there is an unusual way to partially solve this issue, filling the inside of the suit with a specialized liquid, while also using an oxygen-rich breathing medium. Similar experiments have actually been conducted, and under certain conditions, humans are capable of breathing liquid. However, the process itself is extremely difficult and psychologically stressful. The advantage of this approach is that a liquid environment distributes G-forces more evenly throughout the body, reducing the risk of injury during rapid acceleration. But Tony Stark never uses anything anything like this in the films. Because of that, the kinds of maneuvers he performs would most likely result in fatal damage to his body due to the laws of physics alone. Even if Iron Man's suit technology becomes reality someday, it would almost certainly be operated only by specially trained pilots, capable of enduring extreme physical stress and high G-forces. Furthermore, such a suit would most likely become a highly effective tactical tool. It could be used for rapidly securing hard-to-reach positions, reconnaissance missions, sabotage operations, or highly precise strike missions. This kind of technology would probably not be suitable for direct confrontation with a full-scale army. The combat power of the suit is clearly exaggerated in the films. Even with future advances in materials and engineering, a person inside such armor would still remain vulnerable, especially against heavy weapons such as tanks. As mentioned earlier, space travel without additional life support systems would also remain impossible. Nevertheless, as a specialized battlefield platform, this type of technology could still carve out a meaningful role in future warfare. This was MiliTime Fiction. Good luck to everyone and see you next time.